The third time Ethan and I faced each other in family court, he wasn't angry about our divorce anymore. He was angry about what I had asked the judge to do for our 7-year-old daughter. A little over 2 years after our marriage ended, I sat outside a family courtroom in Fort Collins, Colorado, wearing the same sage green cardigan I had pulled on before taking Sophie to school that morning. Across the hallway, Ethan sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his faded navy work jacket open over a gray Henley. We had learned how to exchange backpacks, confirm pickup times, share school notices, and stand 10 feet apart at parent events without making our history everyone else's problem. For a while, I had believed that meant we were good at being divorced. Then several weeks changed everything. It was the third time Ethan and I had been back in court because of the divorce, but legally the marriage itself had been over for a little more than 2 years. This time, we were back over the parenting plan and Sophie's schedule. Ethan wanted more weekday overnights. I had opposed the change because I believed Sophie needed consistency during the school week, especially after the problems we had started noticing around transitions between our homes. Mediation had not resolved it. Now we were back in a courthouse neither of us had ever expected to know this well. Ethan looked up at me. He wasn't shouting. That almost made his words harder to dismiss. "Aren't you ashamed?" he asked. I knew what he meant. He believed I had turned a parenting disagreement into another legal fight. He believed I was protecting my position instead of listening to what our daughter needed. A year earlier, I probably would have answered with an accusation of my own. I would have reminded him how often, during our marriage, he had made decisions first and explained them afterward. I would have told him that divorce had not given him permission to keep doing it where Sophie was concerned. But sitting there, I understood something I had not understood when this began. Neither Ethan nor I had been asking the right question. So I looked at the man I had once married, gave him a small smile, and answered with 2 words. "Ask Sophie." His expression changed. Not dramatically. He simply stared at me for a moment, as though he had expected anger and had received something he could not immediately place. Before he could respond, the courtroom door opened and our case was called. I stood, but my mind went back 3 weeks, to the ordinary Sunday afternoon when this entire dispute had begun. Sophie had just returned from Ethan's rental house. Her light brown hair was tied in a low ponytail, and she was wearing her pale yellow hoodie and white sneakers. She kicked off her shoes inside my townhouse, dropped her backpack beside the stairs, and headed toward the kitchen as casually as if she were about to ask for a snack. Instead, she turned around and said, "Mom, Dad says I'm going to have another bedroom soon." For a second, I thought Sophie meant Ethan had bought a new bed. That would have been ordinary enough. Children describe things strangely sometimes, especially after moving between 2 households. "Another bedroom where?" I asked. Sophie opened the refrigerator and reached for the water pitcher. "At Dad's house." I watched her fill a plastic cup. "You already sleep at Dad's house." "I know." She took a drink, then said, "But this one is going to be mine." There was no worry in her voice. If anything, she sounded pleased. I kept my own reaction out of my face because I did not want Sophie carrying a question that belonged to the adults. "That sounds nice," I said. "Did Dad say anything else about it?" She shook her head and asked whether she could have apple slices. I let the subject go. 10 minutes later, while Sophie sat at the kitchen table doing a reading worksheet, I stepped into the living room and called Ethan. He answered after the second ring. "Everything okay with Sophie?" That was always his first question after a handoff. "She is fine." She told me about the bedroom. Silence lasted just long enough to tell me he knew exactly what I meant. "I was going to talk to you about that." "When?" "When everything was settled." I looked through the doorway at Sophie, who was tracing a sentence with her finger as she read. "Ethan, what does settled mean?" "It means I am getting things arranged." "Things involving Sophie?" "Rachel, she needs a real room here." "I am not arguing with that. I am asking why our 7-year-old knows about this before I do." He exhaled. "Because she was here when I started setting it up." That answer was reasonable, but it did not address what bothered me. During our marriage, Ethan had often believed that if his intention was good, consultation could come later. He would make a practical decision, complete half of it, then explain it as though the finished result should settle any objection. I had hated that pattern when we were married. Divorce had not made it easier to accept when the decision involved Sophie. "Are you changing something about her schedule?" I asked. "I want to." There it was. "And you did not think that was worth discussing before you started preparing a room?" I did think it was worth discussing. I also knew you would react exactly like this. You cannot use my possible reaction as permission not to communicate with me. And you cannot treat every decision I make for Sophie like I am doing something against you. I nearly answered too quickly. Instead, I stopped. Sophie was 20 feet away. Whatever Ethan and I still resented about each other did not belong in her Sunday afternoon. "I am not having this conversation while she can hear me," I said. Ethan's voice softened. "Good. Neither am I." That small agreement did not solve anything, but it kept us from turning an unanswered question into an argument Sophie could overhear. "Then tell me what you are actually proposing." "I will," he said. "Look at the schedule first. Then tell me what you think I am trying to do." The next afternoon, Ethan sent me the proposal. When I opened it, I realized the bedroom was only one part of what he had been planning. The proposal was less dramatic than I had imagined, which made it harder to dismiss. Ethan was not asking to become Sophie's primary parent, and he was not trying to move her away from me. He wanted to add 2 school night overnights during every 2-week cycle and reorganize the rest of our schedule into longer, more predictable blocks. At the bottom, he had included the practical changes he had already made. His supervisor with the Fort Collins Parks Department had approved a revised start time on the morning Sophie would be with him, allowing him to take her to school himself. He had also mapped out pickup times, after-school care when necessary, and the distance between his rental house and her elementary school. I read the proposal twice before calling him. "You changed your work schedule?" I asked. I requested a change. My supervisor approved it. Before talking to me. I needed to know whether it was possible before asking you to consider something I could not actually manage. I understood the logic, even though the familiar sequence still bothered me. "Why do you suddenly need weekday nights?" "I do not suddenly need them. I want to be part of her regular week, Rachel. Homework. School mornings. Packing lunch. All of it. You are already her father. I know that. I am asking to live like one on more than weekends." That landed differently than I expected. Still, wanting something did not automatically make it good for Sophie. Her school was close to my townhouse. Her weekday routine was established there. I handled most homework reminders, appointments, lunches, and morning logistics because that was how our parenting plan had evolved after the divorce. Adding school night transitions could make her week more complicated, not less. "I do not think changing her routine right now is a good idea," I said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then let us take it to mediation." I agreed because mediation seemed more responsible than turning another disagreement into a court fight. A week later, we sat with a family mediator and went through the proposal point by point. Ethan explained how his work schedule had changed. I explained why I believed Sophie's school week consistency mattered. Neither of us threatened the other. Neither of us claimed the other was an unfit parent. That almost made the disagreement more difficult, because there was no obvious villain in the room. Ethan was asking for more ordinary parenting, not control. I was protecting a routine that had worked reasonably well, not trying to erase him. The mediator helped us test several alternatives, but every version required one of us to accept a definition of stability we did not yet share. We left without an agreement. Under the process already governing our parenting dispute, that meant the unresolved schedule issue would return to family court. By then, at least one of my early fears was gone. Ethan was not secretly planning to take Sophie from me. The new bedroom was part of his attempt to make his house a permanent part of her everyday life. I understood what he wanted now. What I still did not understand was why it had become so important to him now. Then, a few nights later, I walked past the refrigerator and noticed Sophie standing in front of our parenting calendar, studying it as carefully as if she were trying to solve a problem neither Ethan nor I had realized we had given her. That night, Sophie stood in front of the refrigerator with one finger resting on the parenting calendar. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Tomorrow." She traced the row until she found the next day. "I am here tomorrow, right?" "Right. Dad picks you up Friday after school." She nodded as if confirming an appointment, then went upstairs. The moment should have felt ordinary. We had used that calendar since the divorce because predictable routines were supposed to make things easier for her. But I could not remember when Sophie had started checking it without asking me. 2 evenings later, I found a small canvas bag beside the front door. At first I assumed it was something she needed for school. Then I looked inside and saw pajamas, a toothbrush, her school sweatshirt, clean socks, and the stuffed rabbit she had slept with since kindergarten. Sophie came down the stairs while I was still holding it. "Are you taking this somewhere?" I asked. "Dad's." "You are not going there until tomorrow." "I know." She reached for the bag. "I pack it early now." "Why?" "So I do not forget stuff when I switch houses." She said it with the calm practicality of a child explaining where she kept her pencils. That was what unsettled me. Nobody had told Sophie to keep a travel bag ready. She had invented the system herself. Because moving between our homes had become something she believed she needed to manage. "Do you forget things a lot?" I asked. "Sometimes. My blue folder was here when I needed it at Dad's. Then my library book was at Dad's when I needed it here. We can fix that. You do not have to worry about carrying everything yourself." "Okay." She took the bag from me and set it neatly beside her backpack. I hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting underneath every conversation Ethan and I had held that week. "Sophie, do you want to stay at Dad's house more?" Her eyes moved toward the refrigerator calendar. Then she shrugged. "I do not know." I waited, but she did not add anything. I could have pushed. Instead, I told her that was fine and asked whether she had finished her reading assignment. She ran upstairs to check. I stayed in the kitchen looking at the calendar. Until then, I had been thinking about stability almost entirely from an adult perspective: school distance, bedtime, work schedules, pickup times, the number of transitions in a 2-week period. Those things mattered. But Sophie's little bag was evidence of something I had missed. Our arrangement was not simply happening around her. She was actively adapting herself to it. The next morning, I moved the spare toothbrush back into the bathroom instead of leaving it in her bag. I texted Ethan and asked whether it would help to keep a second set of basic school supplies at his house so Sophie would have less to carry. He replied, "Good idea." We each bought what she needed for our own homes. Nothing about our schedule dispute had been solved, but for the first time I wondered whether the routine I had been defending as stable felt as simple to Sophie as it looked on my calendar. That afternoon, after I dropped her at school, I asked Ethan to meet me at the neighborhood playground. When he arrived, I did not ask about court, mediation, or overnight counts. I asked the question I should have asked before any of those things. "Why now, Ethan?" Because Sophie asked me a question I could not answer. Ethan stood beside the playground fence with his hands in the pockets of his faded navy work jacket. Children were already inside the nearby elementary school, leaving the playground unusually quiet. "What question?" I asked. He looked toward the empty swings before answering. "A few months ago, she woke up at my place around midnight. She came into my room carrying that stuffed rabbit and asked if she could sleep with the hallway light on. I waited. I told her she could. Then she asked me why she did not have a real bedroom at my house. At the time, Ethan explained, Sophie slept in a small room that still looked temporary. There was a bed and a dresser, but some of Ethan's storage boxes remained against one wall, and most of Sophie's belongings traveled back and forth with her. I told her we could make the room more hers, he said. And then she asked, "Dad, if this is not really my house, where is my house?" I felt my certainty shift. "What did you tell her?" "That both places were her home." Ethan gave a tired shake of his head. But I realized the room was telling her something different. So he cleared out the boxes. He made space for her clothes, books, school supplies, and the ordinary things children should not have to pack every time they visit a parent. Then he began looking at his work schedule. If Sophie was going to feel that his house was truly hers, Ethan did not want her experience there limited to weekend mornings and Sunday handoffs. "Why did you not tell me any of that?" I asked. "Because I knew what you would think the second I mentioned changing the schedule. So instead you built the room, changed your work hours, and waited until Sophie told me." "I know. You made a good intention look exactly like a custody move." This time Ethan did not defend himself. "Yes." That single word changed the conversation more than another argument would have. For once, Ethan had admitted the part that belonged to him without defending it. That made it harder for me to ignore the part that belonged to me. "I assumed the worst," I said. "You had some history to work with. That does not make every assumption right." We stood quietly for a moment. I still did not agree that adding school nights was automatically best for Sophie. Understanding why Ethan wanted the change did not answer whether the change would help her. But the disagreement no longer felt like a hidden contest for control. For the first time, I could see the problem he had been trying to solve, even if I was not convinced his solution was the right one. I left the playground thinking we might finally be able to find a compromise before court. The next afternoon, however, Sophie's teacher contacted both of us. She had noticed a pattern around some of Sophie's transition days, and the same information that should have helped Ethan and me reach an agreement gave us two completely different ideas about what our daughter needed. The message from Sophie's teacher was careful and specific. Sophie was keeping up academically, participating in class, and getting along with the other children. There was no crisis. But on several mornings following transitions between our homes, she had seemed distracted, checking her backpack repeatedly and asking whether she had brought the right folder or book. Once, she had needed a worksheet that was still at Ethan's house. Another time, she had worried that a library book was at mine. Her teacher was not suggesting a custody arrangement. She was simply letting both parents know about a pattern she had noticed. I called Ethan after work. "This is what I have been worried about," I said. "Too much switching. Or it means the switching needs to be more predictable," he replied. I closed my eyes for a moment. A week earlier, that answer would have sounded like Ethan searching for an argument to support what he already wanted. Now I knew better than to assume that. "Explain." "Right now she moves back and forth in short stretches, and she treats my place like somewhere she has to prepare to visit. Longer blocks would mean fewer handoffs. If she has clothes, school supplies, and everything else at both houses, she should not need to keep packing. But adding school nights changes the routine she already knows. The routine she already knows is the one her teacher just told us is causing problems. We do not know that the schedule is causing them. We know she is distracted around transitions." "Exactly. So we should reduce the disruption around those transitions." We were looking at the same facts and reaching different conclusions. I believed Sophie needed one dependable school week base, with fewer changes on mornings when she had class. Ethan believed the problem was not two homes but the way our current schedule made one home feel temporary during the week. Neither of us was arguing about whether Sophie mattered most. We disagreed about what stability actually looked like for her. That distinction kept the conversation from turning into another fight, but it did not make agreement easier. "What if we keep school nights mostly here and make your weekend blocks longer?" I asked. "Then I am still the weekend parent," Ethan said. "And Sophie still has to prepare to go somewhere instead of simply living there. What if we try your schedule and her school mornings get harder? Then we change it." I am not asking us to pretend the first plan has to be permanent. That was more flexible than I expected, but I still could not agree to experiment with Sophie's school week when I was not convinced we understood what was bothering her. We shared the teacher's observations with the mediator, but they did not settle the disagreement because the teacher had never claimed to know which parenting schedule would work best. The information was useful precisely because it showed us the effect without supplying an easy answer. By then, our scheduled family court hearing was approaching, and neither of us had reached a plan we could jointly present. What had begun with my suspicion about a bedroom had become something much harder: two parents who finally understood each other's motives and still honestly disagreed about what their child needed. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether Ethan was trying to take something from me. I started wondering whether both of us were still trying to answer a question that belonged, at least in part, to Sophie. Ethan agreed that neither of us should simply ask her which house she preferred. With our mediator's guidance, we agreed to talk with Sophie together before the hearing, using simple questions about what moving between our homes felt like instead of asking her to choose between them. What she told us was the thought I carried with me when Ethan and I returned to court for the third time. When Ethan asked whether I was ashamed, I answered, "Ask Sophie," because by then I had finally stopped believing that either of us could speak for her simply because we were her parents. That did not mean putting a 7-year-old in the middle of a courtroom and asking her to choose between us. Before the hearing, Ethan and I sat down with Sophie together and made one thing clear: she was not being asked where she wanted to live or which parent she preferred. We only wanted to understand what moving between our homes felt like to her. Her answer was not a choice between Ethan and me. She did not want to live with him instead of me, and she did not want to stay with me instead of him. What bothered her was something neither of us had fully understood. She thought of my townhouse as the place she was supposed to call her real home because she spent most school nights there. Ethan's rental house was Dad's house, even after he gave her a permanent bedroom. Every transition felt like leaving one place where she belonged and entering another place where she needed to adjust. But the hardest part was not the calendar, the backpack, or even the forgotten school supplies. Sophie had started paying attention to how Ethan and I reacted whenever she talked about the other parent. If she told me she liked her new bedroom at Ethan's house, she worried I might think she wanted to leave me. If she told Ethan she missed me during one of his weekends, she worried he might think she wanted to go home early. Neither of us had ever asked her to make that choice. We had not needed to. Children notice more than adults realize. Every defensive pause, every careful question after a handoff, every time one of us treated the other household as a competing place had taught Sophie to measure her words. Sitting there, I understood why the little canvas bag had bothered me so much. I had thought Sophie was learning to manage her belongings between two houses. In reality, she was also learning to manage us. I looked at Ethan. His expression told me he understood it too. His new bedroom had given Sophie a place to belong, and my townhouse had given her a dependable school week base, but neither one could make her feel secure while she believed loving one home might hurt the parent in the other. I no longer wanted the court to preserve my position simply because I had entered the room believing it was the safer one. Across from me, Ethan looked down at the schedule he had proposed and slowly closed the folder. Neither of us had won anything. We had simply discovered that our daughter had been carrying a responsibility that should never have belonged to her. I knew then that I could not leave the courtroom asking for exactly what I had asked for when I entered it. When I looked at Ethan again, I could tell he had reached the same conclusion about his plan. Neither of us needed another argument. We needed a different plan. When the discussion returned to the parenting schedule, I told the court that I no longer wanted to defend the existing arrangement simply because Sophie spent most school nights with me. Ethan said he no longer wanted his original proposal treated as the answer simply because it gave him more weekday time. That mattered. We were not switching sides. We were admitting that both plans had been built around adult assumptions about what stability meant. With the court process and our mediator providing the appropriate framework, we agreed to revise the parenting plan around what we now knew about Sophie's actual experience. The first priority was reducing unnecessary transitions. Instead of moving her back and forth in short stretches, we would use longer, predictable blocks that fit her school schedule and our work responsibilities. We would keep the everyday things Sophie needed at both homes so her backpack could go back to carrying schoolwork instead of half her life. Her stuffed rabbit could travel wherever she wanted, but her toothbrush should not have to. School information would pass directly between Ethan and me, not through our 7-year-old. More important, we agreed to change the way we spoke about our homes. I would stop referring to my townhouse in ways that implied it was Sophie's real home while Ethan's place was somewhere she visited. Ethan would stop treating additional parenting time as proof that his home mattered equally. Neither house needed to defeat the other to belong to our daughter. There was one boundary we both considered non-negotiable. Sophie would never be asked which parent she preferred when Ethan and I disagreed. Her feelings mattered. Her observations mattered. But the responsibility for making adult decisions remained ours. Ethan acknowledged that he had created the bedroom and changed his work schedule before bringing me into the conversation. I thought doing something good for her meant I could explain it afterward, he said. That was the same mistake I used to make when we were married. Hearing him say it without defending himself made it easier for me to admit my own mistake. And I treated stability like something I owned because she spent more school nights with me. When you asked for more time, I heard that as you taking something from me. I paused. Sophie needing more of you does not mean she needs less of me. Nothing about that moment repaired our marriage, and neither of us wanted it to. The divorce had happened for reasons that did not disappear because we finally handled one conflict well. What changed was the relationship we still had to maintain as Sophie's parents. We left with a revised direction for the parenting plan and a shared responsibility to make it work in ordinary life, where there would be no mediator sitting between us. For the first time in weeks, I did not care whether Ethan had received more days or I had preserved more nights. I cared whether Sophie could wake up in either house without feeling that she had left part of her family behind. The legal dispute had finally stopped being the story. What mattered now was whether Ethan and I could live by what we had agreed to after we walked out of that courthouse. A few weeks later, I drove Sophie to Ethan's rental house after school. By then, the revised routine had begun to feel less like an experiment and more like ordinary life. Sophie no longer kept a packed bag beside my front door. Most of what she needed was already waiting for her at Ethan's place, and the school information that once traveled through her backpack now went directly between the two of us. That afternoon, Sophie ran inside ahead of me and called, "Mom, come see my room." I had never actually seen the finished bedroom. Ethan stood near the kitchen in his gray Henley and dark work pants and gave me a small nod. There was no tension in it, no sense that I was crossing into territory that belonged to him. I followed Sophie down the hallway. The room was simple. A bed stood against one wall, with books arranged on a nearby shelf. Her clothes filled part of the dresser. School supplies sat on the desk. Nothing about it looked temporary anymore. Then I noticed two framed photographs on the desk. One showed Sophie with Ethan. The other showed Sophie with me. I looked back at him. "You put that here?" Ethan shook his head. "She did." Sophie was already reaching for a drawing taped above the desk. "Look." She had drawn two houses. I stood in front of one. Ethan stood in front of the other. Sophie had drawn herself between them, smiling, with no suitcase in her hand. Above both houses she had written the same word in large uneven letters, home. Something about that drawing reached me more deeply than anything said in court. For so long, I had assumed the best ending for Sophie would be finding the perfect schedule. Ethan had believed a permanent bedroom would give her the sense of belonging she needed. Both things mattered, but neither was enough by itself. Sophie had never asked us to become husband and wife again. She had never needed the divorce to disappear. She needed to know that the divorce had not divided her into two versions of herself, one for each parent. Ethan and I did not reconcile romantically. We did not discover that our marriage had been a mistake to end. What we restored was narrower, quieter, and far more useful to our daughter, trust that the other parent could love Sophie without taking something away from us. Months later, Ethan texted me one morning after Sophie had spent the night at his house. "She left her science folder here. I am dropping it at school before work so you know where it is." I looked at the message and smiled. He was not asking permission to solve a small problem, and I was not being left to discover afterward what had happened. He was simply keeping me informed. "Thank you," I wrote. Then I added, "She will appreciate that." It was an ordinary exchange, the kind nobody would remember by the end of the week. That was precisely why it mattered. Our progress was no longer happening in courtrooms or difficult conversations. It was showing up in forgotten folders, school mornings, shared information, and the absence of arguments Sophie never needed to hear. Closing reflection: sometimes a family does not heal by returning to what it used to be. It may heal by learning how to become something different without asking anyone, especially a child, to choose which half matters more. Perhaps one of the hardest parts of loving someone after a relationship changes is recognizing the difference between losing control and losing connection. Ethan and I could not give Sophie one household again, but we could stop treating two households as competing claims on her heart. There are moments when stability is less about keeping everything in one place and more about making sure love does not come with a loyalty test. Trust may not return through one dramatic apology. Sometimes it returns quietly, through ordinary choices repeated until nobody has to wonder where they belong. If you had been in Rachel or Ethan's position, how would you have balanced stability, shared parenting, and your child's sense of belonging? What part of their decision would have been hardest for you to make?